In this video, we will cover the civil rights movements of other groups in the 1960s and 1970s. Off the heels of the civil rights movement for African Americans, women, Latinos, and American Indians fight for equality in this turbulent era of American history. During the 1950s, a woman was said to have it all if she had a loving husband, healthy children, and a house in the suburbs. However, many women found that something was lacking. Margaret Mead was an anthropologist whose studies showed that women's low status was a result of a male-dominated society rather than a result of biology. Betty Friedan also thought something was lacking. At her 15-year college reunion, she conducted a survey of her classmates and found that she wasn't alone. She wrote the book The Feminine Mystique. In it, she coined the term feminism, the belief that women should have economic, political, and social equality with men. Many women leaders have been active in the civil rights movement. That led them to adopt the same techniques to promote women's rights. The sexual revolution played a significant role in the women's liberation movement. Sex education, like the use of birth control pills, led women to fight for more control over their lives. NOW, or the National Organization for Women, is an American feminist organization founded in 1966 by Betty Friedan and 28 other women at the Third National Conference of Commissions on the Status of Women. They were inspired by the failure of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to enforce the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Its main goal was to eliminate gender discrimination in employment. It was created to mobilize women, put pressure on employers, and promote full equality of the sexes. NOW also hoped to increase the number of women attending colleges and graduate schools, as well as increasing the number of women in professional jobs. One of the most influential leaders of the women's movement was Gloria Steinem. She was a feminist journalist and a political activist who was recognized as a spokeswoman for the women's movement in the late 1960s and 1970s. Steinem was a columnist for New York Magazine. She also created Ms. Magazine. It was designed to treat contemporary issues from a feminist perspective. In an attempt to address income inequality, Congress passed the Equal Pay Act in 1963. Unfortunately, it left out 2/3 of working women. Remember, during the Civil Rights Movement, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It prohibited discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, and gender. It also created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to handle discrimination cases. Title IX, part of the Educational Amendments Act of 1972, banned sexual discrimination in educational institutions. Title IX promoted gender equity by guaranteeing girls in school the same opportunities as boys. By linking endorsement of the act to federal funding, lawmakers created a powerful financial incentive for schools to provide gender equality to keep from losing federal aid. Title IX has had a major impact on American society. For example, before Title IX, only 1 in 27 girls played varsity high school sports. By 2001, that number had risen to 1 in 2.5. Title IX helped women to pursue higher degrees, compete in sports, and enter jobs in educational fields that had previously been dominated by men. Before Title IX, the number of women attending colleges was significantly lower than men. Today, more women than men are in college. Arguably the single greatest success of the women's rights movement was the 1973 Supreme Court case of Roe v. Wade. The Supreme Court case went back to the 1965 case of Griswold v. Connecticut and its ruling on a citizen's right to privacy, and ruled that women do have the right to choose an abortion during the first 3 months of pregnancy. The women's movement had a mixed bag of success. It did alter society in countless ways by transforming women's conventional roles and their attitudes towards career and family. Television shows in the 1970s showed these changes. Mary Tyler Moore chose a career over marriage and a family. Maude was an independent, strong woman of the 1970s. Carol Burnett had her own successful TV and variety comedy show. This led eventually to political gains for women. Margaret Chase Smith will become the first woman to serve in both houses of Congress. And in 1964, she became the first woman to be placed in nomination for the presidency at a major party's convention. Women began to win seats in many states. Nancy Pelosi became the first woman to lead a major political party, and the first woman to serve as Speaker of the House of Representatives. Both Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton have served as Secretary of State. Hillary Clinton was also the first woman nominated by a major party for president. Another goal of NOW was the passage of an Equal Rights Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The ERA would guarantee that both men and women would enjoy the same rights and protections under the law. In 1972, Congress passed the amendment. In order for it to become part of the Constitution, 38 states would have to ratify it within a decade. By 1982, 35 states had ratified it. It failed by becoming 3 states shy of becoming part of our Constitution. A movement emerged to combat the ERA and the pro-abortion movements. It was known as the New Right. They were pro-family and focused on social, cultural, and moral problems. One leader of the New Right was Phyllis Schlafly. She was against the passage of the ERA. She believed that a woman's place was in the home raising babies. The New Right feared the passage of the ERA, among other things, might lead to the drafting of women into the armed forces. The New Right won. A Latino is someone who claims ancestry from Mexico, Central or South America, or the Caribbean islands. By the 1960s, the Latino jobless rate was nearly 50% higher than that of whites. Cesar Chavez grew up working on farms. His family were migrant farm workers. They moved from farm to farm picking whatever crops were in season. Chavez knew that migrant workers did backbreaking work for very little pay and few benefits. If they wanted any change, they would have to unionize and bargain as one group. He joined with Dolores Huerta to form the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee. Just like Dr. King, he believed in nonviolence to reach his goals. When California grape workers were denied their rights, he organized a nationwide boycott of California grapes. All of their combined efforts allowed Huerta to negotiate a contract that guaranteed higher wages and other benefits that they had been denied. Latinos tried to gain political power as well. The 1960s saw 8 Hispanic Americans elected to the U.S. House of Representatives and 1 senator. Jose Angel Gutierrez didn't trust the two-party system and created La Raza Unida in 1967. It was an independent Latino political party that won Latinos positions in 5 states, mainly on the local level. The Brown Berets protested police brutality in Los Angeles and helped lead the student walkout in a predominantly Hispanic East Los Angeles high schools in 1968. The Chicano movement advocated a form of nationalism not unlike the ideas of Black Power. It provided legal aid and promoted cultural awareness and pride in Latino ethnic heritage. The term Chicano was popularized by Rodolfo Gonzalez, who advocated separatism, like Malcolm X did. Mexican Americans also expressed themselves through a greater appreciation of their culture. Copying the great Mexican muralists of the 1930s like Diego Rivera, Mexican American artists began painting murals in neighborhoods throughout the Southwest in the 1960s, beginning the Chicano mural movement. Murals soon became an important artistic medium to support identity and justice in Mexican American communities. Wall murals provided a visual presence to people who often lacked representation in public life, with few voices on city councils or school boards. In El Paso alone, more than 100 Chicano wall murals were completed. These murals show Taino legends and heroes like Cesar Chavez. There are hundreds of Native American tribes in the United States. In the 1950s, President Eisenhower's termination policy relocated Native Americans from isolated reservations into mainstream urban American life. It was a complete failure. By the 1960s, Native Americans were amongst the poorest Americans and had the highest unemployment rates. They sought greater autonomy by drafting a Declaration of Indian Purpose. It called for the end to the termination program and wanted the government to help create economic opportunities for Native Americans on their reservations. Many young Native Americans were dissatisfied with the slow pace of reform, so they formed the American Indian Movement, or AIM. It started out as a self-defense group, but turned into a militant group that protected the rights of large Native American populations in the northern and western states. In 1972, AIM led a march called the Trail of Broken Treaties. They sought the restoration of 110 million acres of land and the ending or abolition of the Bureau of Indian Affairs because of its corruption. A year later, AIM led about 200 Sioux that seized the town of Wounded Knee, the site where the U.S. cavalry had massacred a Sioux village in 1890. They took hostages. It ended after a confrontation with the FBI left 2 Native Americans dead and many wounded. The government promised to re-examine Native American treaty rights. AIM also took over the abandoned prison at Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay, where they claimed the right of discovery. Native Americans did achieve some victories. In 1975, Congress passed the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. These laws gave tribes greater control over their own affairs and over their children's education. With the passage of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, natives of Alaska got back more than 40 million acres of land and were paid $962 million in cash. However, they continued to have high unemployment, around 40%, in the 1970s, and high dropout rates among high school students. In the boom years following World War II, the U.S. produced and consumed goods faster than it ever had before, causing pollution to skyrocket as great amounts of waste were buried in the soil or dumped into rivers and oceans. As countries become more developed and the world's population grows, pollution of the Earth's air, water, and other resources becomes an ever-increasing threat to the future survival of humankind. Environmentalists lobbied Congress to establish limits on industrial pollution. Congress passed the Water Quality Act in 1965 and the Air Quality Act in 1968. These laws limited the amounts of poisonous chemicals and gases that companies were allowed to release into the environment. Rachel Carson's 1962 book, Silent Spring, revealed the dangers of pesticides, and it caught the immediate attention of the public. The government banned almost all of the use of DDT, a dangerous pesticide, by 1972. On April 22, 1970, Americans celebrated the first Earth Day with a nationwide trash cleanup. This was encouraged by the counterculture and the youth culture of the 1960s. Also in 1970, President Nixon established the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA is responsible for enforcing laws on water and air pollution, toxic waste, pesticides, and radiation. Congress passed the Clean Air Act, which set the air quality standards and tough emissions guidelines for automakers. The Clean Water Act required oil companies to pay for the cleanup of oil spills. The Santa Barbara, California oil spill in 1969 was the cause of this act. During the 1970s, as Americans realized the drawbacks to its heavy dependence on foreign oil for energy, the country turned to alternative fuels. For many, nuclear power seemed to be an attractive alternative. Opponents of nuclear energy warned the public against the industry's growth. They contended that nuclear plants and the waste they produce were potentially dangerous to humans and the environment. Others turned to cleaner fuels of solar power or wind power. In 1978, the Love Canal environmental disaster caused severe illnesses in the Niagara Falls area, where homes and schools were built over a former chemical dump site. The land was contaminated with dioxin. In the early hours of March 28, 1979, the concerns of nuclear energy opponents were validated. That morning, one of the nuclear reactors at a plant on 3 Mile Island near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, malfunctioned. After 2 days, radiation escaped from the crippled reactor. 100,000 residents were evacuated. No one was killed or seriously injured. This caused the government to create stronger safety standards and inspection procedures. In 1980, Congress passed the Superfund Act to clean up Love Canal and other toxic waste sites like 3 Mile Island. Consumer protection also became an issue of activists. Ralph Nader emerged as the leading spokesman in the consumer movement. Ralph Nader's book, Unsafe at Any Speed, from 1965, revealed that 50,000 Americans were dying in car accidents each year, partly because most car bumpers were not strong enough to offer protection against an impact of more than 3 miles per hour. Automakers had to provide safety testing and place seat belts in the vehicles they manufactured. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration was founded for the oversight of transportation safety measures. Americans also demanded higher safety standards in the workplace and called for the elimination of health hazards such as cotton dust, asbestos, toxic chemicals, and noise. A congressional committee found that the U.S. was losing $8 billion a year because of work-related hazards. Responding to this evidence, Congress established the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, in 1970. Its tasks were to carry out inspections and maintain safe conditions in the workplace. The near extinction of the bison and the disappearance of the passenger pigeon helped drive the call for wildlife conservation in the 1970s. President Richard Nixon declared species conservation efforts to be inadequate and pushed Congress to pass comprehensive endangered species legislation. Congress responded with a completely rewritten law called the Endangered Species Act of 1973, which was signed by Nixon on December 28, 1973. The stated purpose of the Endangered Species Act is to protect species and also the ecosystems upon which they depend. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 is considered the Magna Carta of the environmental movement.